Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark Magnacca, and my co-host Rob Brant and I are joined today by Darryl Murphy, Managing Director and Head of Infrastructure Debt at Aviva Investors, one of the UK's largest institutional asset managers. Darryl has spent nearly 3 decades deploying capital into infrastructure across Europe and North America, with 9 years leading Aviva's infrastructure debt desk. Earlier this year, he moderated the infrastructure panel at the Canadian Indigenous Investment Summit in front of nearly 200 senior leaders from United Kingdom, continental Europe, and Canada, of course. In our conversation, you'll hear why Darryl argues that capital is not the constraint and that Canada, in the world we live in today, represents a clear opportunity. Darryl Murphy, Managing Director, Head of Infrastructure Debt, Aviva Investors. Welcome to Drumbeats today.
Thank you very much. Good to see you both again.
Yeah, Darryl, thanks for taking the time, and good to see you again since you joined us for our summit a short time ago. So it's great to see you. Thanks for taking the time. Maybe start by talking a little bit about Aviva and your role there.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Yes, so for those who may not be familiar, as I lead InfraDebt, I sit in Aviva Investors. We are the asset manager within the financial services business of Aviva at a group level. For some people in Canada, you may be familiar with Aviva. We have a rather more of a general insurance business that's very active. And over the past sort of number of years, our group CEO has really refocused the business on 3 key geographies in a sense, which is UK, Ireland, and Canada indeed. So Canada is very important for us, certainly in terms of our insurance business overall. Just briefly, in terms of Aviva Investors, we're very active across a range of obviously public and private markets products. I work with our private market side, which is heavily leans upon what you might call real assets, so infrastructure and real estate. And obviously my conversation today is as head of the infrastructure debt desk, something I've done at Aviva for around 9 years. So we've been very active on infrastructure, and Canada does historically something that we've been very keen to develop, not least of which given our group presence, but also how we see appetite and opportunity in terms of the local market.
Great, thank you for that. And Darryl, just before we go on a bit further, you also have a bit of affinity for working with Canadian firms or spending some time in Canada overall on your career. So I think we should mention that, ties that bind.
I do, yes. It's interesting. I guess at least I have a base understanding of the Canadian market on that sense. So I actually spent 2 years in a much younger life when I was working originally at Hambros, Canada, but we were acquired by Société Générale when I was there in the late 90s, and I actually spent 2 years working in Toronto. Very early days of infrastructure. We probably, a bit like Europe, probably infrastructure wasn't used as the term these days. It's sort of seemingly become all-encompassing. It's not a new thing, but it wasn't a thing as such. And then I've actually went on to work for New Corp Capital, which was based out of Canada, albeit in London. And then I actually moved to RBC in London as well. So that was slightly accidental. It wasn't necessarily through my sort of Canadian lineage, as it were. But for those reasons, I've obviously had always a great affinity to your country.
Great. Well, that obviously helped you because you've just been at the Canadian Indigenous Investment here at the London Stock Exchange with us, where you moderated the infrastructure panel with nearly 200 senior leaders from Canada, the UK, and continental Europe in the room. But before we get into the substance of that, just tell us a little bit about what you felt it was like in the room, the energy and the conversations that struck you, because this was your first time attending the summit.
Absolutely, and I have to say, thank you again, obviously, for the invite to join and moderate. It was perhaps a very good vantage point moderating a session than having to directly contribute. So I learned a lot from that. But to your point, I think, firstly, congratulations on a very successful event. I would say good venue. Well selected there in terms of the stock exchange. But moreover, to your point, what did strike me was the level of positive energy in the room. I think I appreciate, like all things in life, we're dealing here with a number of people obviously knew each other. A number of Canadians in the room had probably travelled over from London, which I appreciate. At the moment, it's not particularly easy, but that was good to see, and a good diverse mix of people in terms of levels of understanding and vantage points in this important area. So, I mean, what struck me was the sort of engagement and positivity that was there, and I think that's I think that reflected very well in terms of the engagement and dialogue. And I think the other thing to say is, as an observation, perhaps more about the event and just the energy, was very notable in terms of some very senior individuals who joined, and it really emphasised and endorsed the seriousness of the commitment towards this area. So I think that struck very positively. And dare I suggest that in infrastructure in particular, it's very easy to go to a lot of events. So I think it stood out well. I think when you look at some of the sort of events that I've certainly attended, because of that sort of energy and focus.
That's great to hear, Darryl. I'm curious, Aviva is a large organization. Am I correct that $500 million of assets under management make you one of the bigger players in Canada? What's interesting about the Canadian market to Aviva or yourself? And has that view of Canada changed recently?
Yeah, so I think it's multifaceted, right? As I mentioned, Aviva has obviously presence in Canada. We're not global in virtue of the way we as a general business. So therefore, and if I go back historically, one of the reasons we started to look at Canadian infrastructure was an alignment to our colleagues in the general insurance business. So in that particular case, we provide a lot of surety products, and therefore there was a synergy with some of the construction activity in Canada. So therefore, my insurance colleagues were saying, well, can't we bring some of our investment capability into this market? I think as at today, we have a growing focus in distribution. So in a sense, our sort of sales and distribution area where we're bringing external clients in. I should stress that we don't just invest for Aviva. Aviva as a client is very important for us as Aviva Investors. We also invest for external clients as well, and therefore we have a growing distribution team based out of Toronto in Canada as well, because we see actually Canadian investors are an important part of our mix. So there's a good synergy there. I think then therefore you can see there's a lot of support corporately. We then come back to, I guess, what you might say is my day job, which is how do we invest in infrastructure? What are we looking for on a global basis? And it's fair to say, most of our activity has obviously historically been very much in the UK. We have grown over a number of years to be strong in Europe, and we've had a growing interest in Canada. In infrastructure terms, we don't invest anywhere else. And to some degree, that's driven a lot by our client requirements, as it were, and our experience as a more European player. But I think the important thing is that, as you're well aware, for any investor, diversification is really important. And everyone asks me, where do you go if you're fairly active in Europe? Where else do you look? North America in general is an obvious place on that basis. And maybe we don't have long enough here to discuss the merits of Canada against US as markets. So obviously in infrastructure terms, Canada represents a good opportunity. So you can appreciate it's a supply and demand point. So we're seeking high quality infrastructure assets in a form that we can understand and analyze from a European perspective. And obviously the Canadian heritage and opportunity set does match that very well. So it's a natural, I think, investment environment. And I think for those reasons, that's why we see good alignment. And I have to say, probably like most countries in the world, but Canada's not immune from the fact we all need to invest in more infrastructure. So, in whatever way, shape or form, we've got, an energy transition, increase in digital, improving transportation. You have some very particular requirements, as we do in Europe, but overall, there is an immense level of investment needed. So therefore, that's an obvious gravitational pull, should we say, for investors.
Thank you for that interesting background and talking about where Canada fits in your mix and what you've been looking at. Coming back a bit to the summit. So you had 4 panelists that you were moderating: the First Nations Major Project Coalition, First Nations Financial Authority, Canada Infrastructure Bank, and Longhouse Capital. So it was a pretty interesting group of people of the institutional ecosystem as it is at the moment, and it's still developing. But having heard them in that room, what is your read of how that is developing, and what are the gaps that you see need to close before European institutional capital flows at scale? I mean, you're already there, but I'm sure you saw that some comparisons versus other markets you're participating in, particularly in the Indigenous opportunities that are associated with infrastructure.
Indeed. And I think the first thing to note was, I guess I couldn't have wished for a better view of the landscape than those institutions on the panel. Produced a lot of good kind of complementary observations around where the market is. I think the thing to note that maybe I hadn't fully appreciated, which may sound obvious in hindsight, is the level of effective government support into the initiative, and obviously recognising the importance of investment in within the Indigenous communities. In terms of that support, I think for example, I knew a reasonable amount from the Canadian Infrastructure Bank historically in terms of activity, and I was kind of curious how they're leaning into this important area. I think the thing to note was, particularly if you look at the First Nations Financial Authority, to see their activity. And I think what I was keen to do as moderator was kind of bring this to life, because we're not talking about some hypothetical plans here. They had some really good practical examples how some very serious money have been brought to bear on good opportunities. So I think that's really what brings it to life. So I think for any potential investor, whether ourselves or anyone else in Europe, the key thing really comes down to seeing that opportunity set in front of you. I think the last thing to say, maybe we get into this a bit further, is it was interesting, obviously, with Longhouse Capital, because there we're seeing effectively what you might say a sort of like-minded, or perhaps a sort of similar family of looking at private capital, institutional capital into the market. So what stood out is, therefore, this is not in looking at the Indigenous investments, this is not something that's a purely state-backed kind of activity where investors are going to need heavy levels of support from governments. There is a clear proposition that it can be these are infrastructure assets first and foremost that one can understand, and the environment that they're being invested in is something which private investors can access, and that's what really stood out to me. So I think it's great to see other private investors who are actively engaged in the market.
Absolutely, and Indigenous-led private investors like Longhouse. And Darryl, you mentioned there are lots of infrastructure conferences you could attend. You chose one focused on Indigenous investments in Canada. Are you starting to see Indigenous participation pop up in some of the deals you're looking at?
Thus far, I have to admit no, and I think maybe what this event has done is open my eyes to the sort of opportunity set around us. I think there's an important point here around what the shape of that looks like. I think that certainly, I think there's a point here about how the market can access these assets more readily. Potentially, the role for third parties, intermediaries, about how that can be perhaps packaged and presented to international investors, and we have to be necessary ourselves. And I think that's something that I'm kind of interested in, which is the next step from this is where that access is. And for want of a better point, Rob, and I'll say this sort of tongue in cheek, right? In a sense, investors are quite lazy, right? And what I say in terms of, we want everything kind of packaged and presented to us a lot of the time, and I think all the key ingredients are there. I mean, there's a lot of hard work been done here. I think it's hard to sort of challenge any of the fundamentals on governance, where he's put the business plans, etc. The key now is just how you mobilize that capital. And to some degree, I mean, I come from a market in Europe where I always say capital is not the challenge, right? We have an execution delivery challenge, not a capital challenge. And I'd like that to be the case in Canada as well, where there should be a lot of capital banging on the door for these opportunities, particularly given the work's been done to put that firm governance in place.
Yeah. Well, I love hearing that, because part of the reason for the summit is to try and package up some of those opportunities from Canada and present them to people like yourself. And to hear that it is not part of your day-to-day experience sitting in London, but that it maybe sparked some ideas, and that it was time well spent. That's great to hear.
Yes, and that's why we have also talked about now the Canadian Indigenous Investment Forum, to provide a source and regular feed of information and opportunities in Canada to help educate those who are overseas, and also to make it easier, because as you said, investors are lazy. Everybody is, to a certain extent. So how do you make it easy? It's like any product or service, and these opportunities, how do you get in front? And as Rob mentioned, that's why we've established this platform for the Indigenous peoples to come here and tell their stories and to see their opportunities, because you know better than anyone, Darryl, it all begins with a relationship and a conversation. But it all starts with that. Have a discussion, interesting, and start to progress that over time. So also on your panel was Mark Podlasly, the CEO of the First Nations Major Project Coalition, and they're working with around 300 of Canada's 650 First Nations, which excludes the Inuit and the Métis, but that's still a very healthy proportion of the Indigenous peoples of Canada on major resource and infrastructure projects. And Mark, as you know, also sits on the CIC board. So it was an interesting perspective that I think he brought into the conversation. And I think that was probably the first time you'd heard about the FNPC. And given your background, again, working across Europe, what did you think in terms of what FNPC offers potential investors who are partnering with Indigenous nations who are using their services? Does that raise your comfort level? And
it was great to meet Mark. I think the role of FMMPC is critical. I see this a lot in Europe because, as I mentioned before, a lot of the problems in infrastructure is not really the financing and all the the things that we think is clever at the back end of a project. It's actually getting those projects shaped, the business plan in place, and ready for delivery. And I mentioned that investors are lazy. Of course, we want these things packaged up. And I think what came across was, when I opened the points about, okay, well, this sounds a great idea in theory. Where's the practice? And we talked about some projects and investments that have been made. So what's that pipeline look like? And it was quite sort of staggering that Mark had this kind of lengthy pipeline off, sort of reading off his out of his hand, as it were. So I can see the important role they play. And, ideally, everything is different. And you're going to be having to deal with lots of different stakeholders. But the key here is trying to create something that's reasonably standardized, as it were. So, there are any sort of key elements, and probably some guidance that's necessary from Mark's organizational side as to how to structure a business plan into an investable proposition. And this is something that, is not unusual in Europe. We see this at a government level, lots of entities in place to try and put in place that sort of area of pipeline. And I think, therefore, for an investor such as ourselves, that's kind of critical, because that means you've got those investments that are being sort of driven the right way. There's clearly dialogue from Mark's organization, particularly into the Indigenous communities, around, okay, what's the role that we play? How do we set these particular projects up, as it were? So I think that's something that really can give a lot of comfort to investors, that there's some broader. And again, it's not everyone's sort of style, but I think that broader sort of more, so we say, centralized sort of standardization where possible, that you're not having to reinvent the wheel every time that an investment's made.
Thanks for that. I'm sure FNPC is pleased with that sort of feedback. It helps them, and that's why so many of the Indigenous nations have chosen them as a partner. Darryl, you spent nearly 3 decades in infrastructure finance and seen several waves of market development: the P3 revolution, the renewable energy build out, social infrastructure expansion. Sitting in that room on 8th of April, did Indigenous infrastructure opportunity feel like the beginning of one of those, structural cycles, or is it something different?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because, as you say, the Canadian market has been through those areas, and what I was spending a lot of time in my previous sort of incarnations were, things like sort of the P3 market, which in the great scheme of things wasn't huge in great terms, but obviously it was an important step in terms of developing certain types of infrastructure. I think the important thing for me is that, I'm probably left thinking the reverse, which is why is Indigenous infrastructure investment not already quite a well established point, sort of opportunity. So I think you're right in noting that it's to the extent it's nascent as an interesting point as to why. I think what's really interesting when we dig underneath that, this is my sort of ignorance was more, my very historical understanding was probably more localized projects, as it were, particularly related to certain nations. But in terms of the investment need today, when we start talking about critical infrastructure for Canada as a country, particularly when you think about interesting examples around sort of transmission, etc. A lot of activity which obviously spans across a huge vast swathes of land, then that's critical infrastructure, and that is very large, and that is a huge opportunity. So on that basis, this should, I think my takeaway from this is that in a politest way, this is not just a thing, as it were, on that side. It should really be, I took away the point that investing into critical infrastructure in Canada goes hand in hand, respecting the idea of actually Indigenous investments, and therefore creating the right environment for those investments is critical. So I think all in all, that's a great segue for something that should just define the market as such, and really stop it being seen as a. I know that was kind of the theme of the event in a sense, which is stop this being perceived as some kind of barrier to investment and saying there is simply a big market opportunity in front of us.
Yes. So we talk, if Canada's on your radar, you have to learn to work with the Indigenous peoples because they are rights holders. The Constitution has recognized that. Canada signed up for UNDRIP. So I think you've articulated that very well. Basically, Canada has a huge need for infrastructure, and you're going to have to work with the Indigenous peoples.
Darryl, I'm curious, for someone interested in your investment, where's the sweet spot for the debt that you place? What type of project, size, duration?
Certainly, Robin, I should have perhaps set this out at the outset. We have a range of capital available. I think the focus of my side in particular is where we have access to significant amount of capital from our insurance clients internally. Now that is not unusual capital in a Canadian context, because obviously there's a lot of life cos in Canada who have very similar appetite themselves. We invest alongside a lot of Canadian insurance companies, whether it be obviously in Canada, but increasingly they come to Europe. It's kind of ironic, isn't it, that they come to Europe looking for big opportunities when we said there's quite a lot of opportunity on the doorstep, as it were. And therefore, what is the characteristics of that investment? Well, again, for us, as particularly its insurance capital, typically looking for longer duration. And what does that mean? Well, that could be, we've been making investments into assets which are 10, 20, even 30 years, subject to the right contractual or regulatory frameworks. We do work under a regulatory model, probably again not dissimilar to Canadian life cos, where we are focused more on investment grade debt in that context, and clearly overall we're looking for, and perhaps the controversial thing of course is we're always looking for relative value. So but infrastructure debt inherently should drive that inherently positive risk and return. And when I'm talking glibly about infrastructure, I mean the neat thing is we're talking about the types of assets which are readily part of the investment need in Canada, as it were. So particularly we look towards energy transition, digitalization, transport. These are going to be a commonality, social infrastructure. There's a good alignment. So that meets a lot of our sustainability requirements, our focus on, actually the way we want to invest. The key is just aligning that risk and return. And that's where it really comes down to the detail, and probably the next step, which is actually looking at how we can align that appetite to the opportunity set.
Yes, and we were at the FNPC conference, and we had the opportunity to interview the CEO of OMERS, one of the Maple 8, and he highlighted an important point that the pension funds are looking for assets that are up and running. And they're looking, okay, we'll invest that because there's proven track record, et cetera, not so much on the development side. Do yourselves at Aviva have the same place? That's where you're looking after the assets up and running with a proven revenue stream, or do you also invest in the development of some of those projects?
Yes, I think to cover a number of points there, and it's great that you've engaged across the OMERS. I'll say as a separate point, it's we had a bit of this discussion in and around the event, which is my curiosity to see how much of the domestic market was engaged around Indigenous investment. It was good to see a number of the Canadian banks that obviously we work with being represented there. Curious around exactly the Maple 8, etc. We see them heavily focused on Europe. Their equity funds investing a lot of assets that we would see and we would provide debt for, and obviously they are one of they form the set of some of the largest infrastructure investors globally. So I think to that appetite, it's interesting because it depends on, obviously fundamentally the answer is always it depends, I guess, but the reality is we do finance into construction assets. I challenge a little bit. I think there's a lot of equity funds who can look at effectively greenfield development. It depends what I mean by development. I think the challenging thing for a lot of investors is very early stage development, which in my head I would call pre-construction side, where you maybe that's a difficult area. There are those that can provide that. I can argue in some cases, given there is a lot of kind of allied sort of state capital, should we say, public capital that's available. That's the role that can be played there. Maybe I would open that, the Canadian Infrastructure Bank can potentially look at some of those areas. The key, though, is when it comes to construction assets, that's not something that, we don't have to look at things which are just, in quotes, boring operational infrastructure. I set out before, obviously, the important thing for us is more about credit rating, but it's quite it's quite amenable to actually invest into construction assets which are investment grade, and we've done that in a number of activities. Most P3 assets in Canada, even large sort of road projects, etc., would be investment grade during construction, as an example. So, in a sense, I would really put a challenge out there for Canadian investors, particularly Maple 8, that I think this is where the great success would come, because there is a bigger question, which is they really should be pushing this further. And to a greater degree, I think that's the ecosystem that we need to build above here. Because if we see Canadian investors investing directly, if we see some of our peers, but Canadians, the sort of Sun Lifes, etc. of the world investing into these assets, and also I think there's a key role for the banking market. And even in Europe, we work very closely with banks, whether it be for arrangers or structuring or advising, how they bring that capital in. So we need to see that full breadth of that sort of investor ecosystem being applied into these Indigenous projects. And I think then you will definitely see a flow of more international capital.
Definitely. And you talked about that early stage and the need sometimes for early equity, and perhaps the new federal government announcement about a new sovereign wealth fund, and capitalizing it with $25 billion. Perhaps that's a hole that they could fill, along with some of the other tools that already exist.
I definitely agree.
As you look around the world, and you touched on this earlier, Darryl, but Canada's approach to Indigenous participation in infrastructure projects Is it unique? Are you seeing other parts of the world adopt it? Are there any lessons for Europe or other parts of the world, do you think?
I think it's interesting. Obviously, there's and I know there's been discussion at the event around broader global consideration, where many of the countries looking at how they bring investments alongside their indigenous communities, and I'm kind of curious on that. And as a side show, I'm meeting someone from New Zealand government next week, actually, and I think it'd be an interesting question to them as to how this plays in a country such as New Zealand. I think the obvious benefit you have from a Canadian point of view, dare I suggest, is sheer size. So if you look at your infrastructure needs and the requirements of your, for a country, and its economic position, such as Canada, there should be a lot to learn for others from that point of view, because all due respect, someone like New Zealand, it will have a lot of infrastructure needs, but it'll be quite focused. So I think the read across, the obvious read across, will be to other countries where there's a delicate balance into how to make investments, particularly where there is indigenous people with rights across land, and that enters into the same debate. That's a clear, learning. I think the two-way learning, as we talked before, is if you transcend above that, is how do you actually deliver assets themselves? And I say openly, and it sounds like I'm saying it just because I'm on this call, but the reality is Canada historically has often been held out as being very strong in the way it procures. It goes through public procurement, the way it operates commercially. It's been seen as an investor-friendly environment. So it's got a lot going for it in a sense, right? And I think, some of that delivery expertise could be learnt by others. I said in Europe, what do we suffer today with? It's fundamentally, how we actually deliver projects and align public and private capital and expertise together. So I think there's a lot to learn everywhere in here. It's a global village, I think, in infrastructure terms, right? So hopefully there's a lot to learn from everyone. And I think this is the point of Indigenous investment shouldn't be seen as a sort of minority sport, as it were, in the Canadian context. I think it has ramifications elsewhere.
Yes, it's a critical part of how Canada is going to develop its infrastructure and economy over the next years and decades, because if you touch the land, sea, or air in Canada, you're going to run into an Indigenous nation who has the right not just to be consulted and dealt with, but they've got a seat at the table, and they want to develop these assets and opportunities. It provides them revenue for their community, and the wealth transfer that's taking place now, because the Indigenous nations, and of course it's a mixed picture across the country, but they are wealth holders, and they'll be looking, how do they invest and grow their wealth over time with partners, not only in Canada, but globally, because they're going to be on the other side of the equation with money to deploy and how to invest that and get the best return. So I think it is an interesting time. Given your role, what do you wish you'd learned a year ago? Or maybe it should have just come to the summit a year ago.
Maybe that's in great hindsight. Yes, it is probably on that side. I think I come back to what I mentioned earlier, which is I sort of left scratching my head slightly as to that point about not necessarily coming to the event, but why is Canadian investment of this nature and involvement of Indigenous people being less visible? I think that's I kind of been mulling over that as a question myself, and that's something to say, particularly given we've been close to actually Canadian infrastructure. It's just illustrated that maybe not close enough in terms of how that market's developed. So I think it's that ends up with looking like we have to make up for lost time on that basis. But yeah, I think we stand in a good place today, which is saying, well, there's a clear proposition that deserves more attention.
For the UK and European investors in our audience who weren't in the room on A3, what would you say to them?
Well, and of course I would say this, Mark, but I think the first thing is they should definitely join the event next year on the basis I'm sure you're planning already a similar event. No, I think the serious thing is that this is an area it's worth looking at. So it's great. I mean, great that I think That's not to say that you wait, just a little under 12 months before finding out more. I think it's definitely something that's worthwhile. I'd like to feel that there's a great opportunity here. And it's kind of a rarity to find something where there's great alignment. I think the challenges to the extent are all kind of manageable. I think people who work in the infrastructure space are very used to that in any case, in any jurisdiction. So I think there's something here for everyone to say, look, there is a real opportunity set here, which as you're doing a grand job in advertising, is not as well known as perhaps it should be as an opportunity. So I would say, get involved, get engaged, and I can only maybe you have to look at even bigger venue next year, hopefully. But no, I'm sure it'll be a great success, and you'll keep building off the ever increasing momentum in this important sector.
Darryl, is there anything we haven't touched on yet that we should?
No, I think the key thing is really just to bring out this point that as we get into, where do we go from here, as it were, the fundamental thesis is clear, right? In terms, and I think that's, and I think you're, again, I think congrats on your event. It kind of brought all the right parties together. In all things in life, and particularly investment, as you well know, Rob, is the devil's in the detail. And I think the key thing, next steps, is this isn't new. It's it's not a conceptual idea. Obviously, there's investment happening, there's capital moving, you've got all the pieces in play. In terms of international investments, or just fundamentally delivering the pipeline of opportunity, is going to need just that bigger push. And I think I would return back to my points on the way to really making that open is probably the detail. And I do think this is where, and maybe the theme of this is, all I'm going to do is take away when people make me feel that I'm just totally a lazy investor. But his points about the packaging, etc., and where's that going to come from? And I do think there's a role for, in my head, Canadian banks, specialist advisors, etc., who can really make this, who are connected. Infrastructure is a global community, and I think those connections will start to attract that capital further.
Thank you for that. And thank you, Darryl, just in general, for, first of all, agreeing to moderate a panel. Great feedback from the session. And, thank you for this follow-up podcast.
Appreciate the time, Darryl. Really insightful, and look forward to seeing you again very soon.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks.
Thank you to Darryl Murphy for sharing his insights with us. And thank you for viewing and listening. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.